Imagine walking into a room where every leader is the loudest voice, the sharpest suit, and the smartest in the room, or so they think. Now imagine a different room. One where a leader listens more than they speak, where decisions come from empathy, not ego, where people feel seen, heard, and valued pure. Always to it. The difference between those two leaders? One leads to impress. The other leads to inspire. We live in a world that tells us to be strong, competitive, even ruthless to get ahead. But true leadership, the kind that builds trust, loyalty, and lasting impact, that kind of leadership doesn't come from the ego. It comes from the heart. Today, I want to challenge a belief we've been taught for far too long, that to lead, we have to dominate. Truly lead, we have to serve. Let's explore what happens when we lead not to be right, but to do right. When we put people before pride. And when heart becomes our greatest leadership tool, ego seeks control. Heart builds connection. It's a simple contrast, but within it lies the difference between manipulation and inspiration, between authority and authenticity, between short-term compliance and long-term loyalty. When a leader leads with ego, their primary concern is how they are perceived. Their focus is on maintaining power, on being the smartest person in the room, on asserting dominance rather than inviting dialogue. The ego-driven leader wants to win, and in doing so, they often forget what leadership is actually about. People. Ego pushes leaders to speak more than they listen. Drives them to make decisions that serve their image, not the collective good. They lead through fear, pressure, and position. They may get results, but the cost is high burnout, disengagement, and a culture where people feel like tools rather than teammates. Ego is obsessed with being in control. I bet. It wants certainty, it wants predictability, it wants to micromanage. It fears vulnerability because vulnerability exposes cracks in the armor, and the ego cannot allow that. So it builds walls, emotional ones, psychological ones. It distances itself from real connection because connection requires humility. But here's the truth. People don't want to be managed, they want to be led. And there's a big difference. Leading with heart flips the script. Instead of asking, how can I stay in control? The heart-led leader asks, how can I serve? Instead of demanding respect, they earn it. They understand that real leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about taking care of those in your charge. The heart-led leader isn't afraid of vulnerability. In fact, they know it's their greatest strength. When they admit they don't have all the answers, when they show empathy, when they genuinely listen, they create a space where others feel safe to do the same. And safety is the foundation of trust. When people trust their leader, they don't just comply, they commit. They bring their full selves to the table. They go the extra mile, not because they have to, but because they want to. That's the power of connection. And connection can't be forced. It has to be felt. It has to be earned through consistency, through compassion, through the quiet confidence of a leader who doesn't need to dominate to be effective. The heart-led leader knows that leadership isn't about having followers. It's about creating more leaders. Ego says, oh, look at me. Heart says, I see you. Ego says, I know what's best. Heart says, help me understand what you need. Ego says, do what I say. Heart says, let's build this together. One pushes people away. The other brings people closer. In times of pressure, ego reacts. It snaps, it blames, it deflects. The heart responds with patience, presence, and perspective. That difference in energy is felt deeply by teams, and over time, it shapes culture. We've all had bosses who led with ego. Maybe they were brilliant. Maybe they delivered results. But we walked away from those experiences feeling small, overlooked, or simply used. Now think of the leader who saw potential in you before you saw it in yourself. The one who lifted you up, who believed in you, who gave you space to grow. That's the leader who led with heart. That's the one you still remember. Not just for what they achieved, but for how they made you feel. Heart-led leadership doesn't mean weakness. It's not about being soft or avoiding difficult conversations. It means having the courage to do what's right, not what's easy. It means holding people accountable in a way that empowers rather than shames. It means setting clear boundaries while also showing compassion. The heart is fierce when it needs to be, but it always moves from a place of care, not control. When a leader chooses heart over ego, they stop trying to prove themselves and start improving others. They stop managing impressions and start building relationships. They create a ripple effect. Their presence gives others permission to lead with honesty, to show up authentically, and to connect beyond job titles and tasks. This kind of leadership is rare, not because it's difficult, but because it's vulnerable, and vulnerability feels risky. But the greater risk is leading from ego, because in the long run, ego isolates, ego exhausts, ego breaks down trust. It might win short-term battles, but it loses the war for people's hearts. Organizations that thrive in the long run are led by people who prioritize connection over control. These leaders understand that when people feel connected, when they feel seen, supported, and inspired, they give their best, not because they're told to, but because they want to. They believe in the mission. They trust their leader. They feel like they belong, and belonging changes everything. Connection transforms the culture from competitive to collaborative, from transactional to transformational. It opens the door to innovation, to creativity, to resilience. When people know their leader cares, they care more too. They show up differently. They engage differently. They lead differently. In a world where leadership is often associated with status, ego tells us that success is about being the best. Heart reminds us that success is about bringing out the best in others. That's the choice every leader faces, every day in every interaction. Will I lead from ego, or will I lead from heart? Will I seek control, or will I build connection? Because you can't do both. Leading with heart turns followers into believers. It transforms the very nature of leadership from a top-down directive into a shared journey. When a leader operates from the heart, they don't just command attention, they earn trust. They don't just give orders, they give purpose. And in doing so, they cultivate something far more powerful than compliance: belief. Belief is not something that can be demanded. It can't be bought, forced, or manipulated. It has to be nurtured. It's earned over time through authenticity, consistency, and care. A leader who leads with heart understands that belief is the foundation of a resilient, motivated, and purpose-driven team. When people believe, not just in what they're doing, but in why they're doing it and who they're doing it and who they're doing it with, they go beyond their job descriptions. They show up differently. They invest emotionally. They grow into the mission. Followers may do what they're told. Believers take ownership. They become advocates. They become leaders in their own right. This is how movements start, not with orders, but with a vision that speaks to something deeper. Something human, and only a leader with heart can tap into that. The heart-led leader doesn't focus on being admired. They focus on being real. They know that people don't need perfect leaders. They need honest ones. Leaders who can admit mistakes. Leaders who listen. Leaders who genuinely care about their people not as resources, but as human beings. That kind of leadership creates space for others to believe in more than a paycheck or a promotion. It invites them to believe in a shared purpose. When a leader leads from ego, their team may follow out of obligation, out of fear, out of duty. But fear-based leadership has a ceiling. It may generate performance, but not passion. It may result in productivity, but never full potential. People don't grow in environments where they feel like cogs in a machine. They grow where they feel seen, valued, encouraged. Belief is born when people feel connected to something greater than themselves. A leader who leads with heart understands this. They make it their mission to connect individual contributions to the bigger picture. They don't just say what needs to be done. They explain why it matters. They bring meaning into the workplace. They help people understand that their work isn't just about tasks, but about impact. And that impact starts internally. When someone believes they matter, they begin to act like they do. They show more initiative. They speak up more. They support others more. They lead without the title. That's how a heart-led culture spreads, from one inspired individual to the next. From one moment of belief to a movement of purpose, a leader who leads with heart doesn't need to have all the answers. What they need is clarity of values and consistency in action. They align their behavior with what they say they stand for. They model the kind of character they want to see in others. And because of that alignment, people trust them. And where there's trust, belief can grow. You can feel the difference between a team that's led with heart and one that isn't. In a heart-led team, there's energy, there's ownership. There's a shared sense of responsibility and pride. People challenge each other, but they also support one another. There's room for ideas, for mistakes, for growth. There's less posturing and more purpose. less competition, and more collaboration. Because belief creates unity. The power of belief is that it can withstand pressure. It doesn't collapse in crisis. When people believe in their leader and the mission, they don't run when things get tough. They rally, they innovate, they push through setbacks because they know what they're fighting for. This is the kind of loyalty that can't be mandated. It can only be inspired. Heart-led leaders understand the emotional landscape of leadership. They know that people are driven by meaning, not just metrics. They ask, "How are you really doing?" Not as small talk, but because they genuinely care. They create space for humanity in the workplace. And that humanity becomes a source of strength, not weakness. When people feel that their leader is invested in them as people, not just as performers, it changes the dynamic completely. They no longer feel like tools to achieve someone else's vision. They feel like co-creators of something meaningful. And when people feel ownership, they bring passion. They bring heart. That's the multiplier effect of belief. The shift from follower to believer is subtle, but powerful. A follower waits to be told what to do. A believer asks, "How can I help move this forward?" A follower needs external motivation. A believer is driven by internal conviction. A follower shows up for the paycheck. A believer shows up for the purpose. Leading with heart doesn't require grand speeches or dramatic gestures. It shows up in the little things, in a listening ear, in a thank you note, in a thank you note, in a moment of grace, in a leader staying behind to support the team instead of rushing to their next appointment. It's in being present, being real, being kind without being soft. These small acts of care add up. Over time, they form a bond, and that bond becomes belief. And belief becomes the fuel that drives performance, creativity, resilience, and commitment. Ego wants to be followed. Heart inspires others to believe. And when people believe, they don't just do their jobs, they change the game.